Eastern time, and we've got a lot of stuff to do over these next 2 hours. So welcome to the workshop, Building Detections in Azure. Before we get started, though, I just want to mention that we are going to be using Slack throughout these 2 hours. If you've been part of a SANS workshop before, you probably still have your access to this, but if not, we do have a link that was working. Now it's not. We have a new link for you. I will ask Laura if you wouldn't mind, because I think the way Zoom works, I could be totally wrong here, that if we posted something in the chat and then you joined afterwards, you don't see the chat. So I'll ask Laura one more time to post that link for everyone to see. That will get you to the proper Slack workspace where we can provide you support. We being myself, Sean McCullough, co-author of the course that I'm going to be discussing in just a little bit. And of course, Laura Dawson will be here to help you out throughout these next 2 hours. All right. So with that out of the way, again, it's pretty straightforward. If you've used Slack before, shouldn't be too different for you. We're just going to be using 3 channels in that workspace. General, you're going to be seeing a bunch of links show up throughout the discussions to the course, to any other like blog posts or webcasts that I mentioned throughout. But where you can communicate with us, if you're having issues with the workshop or just want to discuss anything at all, we have the discuss channel and we have the help channel. So it's pretty obvious what you would use those for moving forward. But like I said, it's going to be very, very hands-on in this workshop. I totally forgot to introduce myself. Let me do that quickly. My name is Ryan Nicholson. I'm one of the creators, I must say, of this workshop. Who's not with us today is an up-and-coming instructor for the SEC 541 course, Cloud Security Monitoring, we'll just call it that for short, Alex Browlick. He put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this workshop, so I got to give him a ton of credit. But as you can see, based on the title, we're going to be building some detections inside of Azure, and not just detections, but also have some cool automations throughout this as well. All right. So again, I'm Ryan Nicholson. I'm one of the authors of the SEC 541 course, and along with us today is Sean McCullough, providing assistance, some additional support if you run into any issues. So feel free to reach out to either one of us throughout the workshop if you're having any kind of issues. So here's what we're looking at in our workshop today. Like I said, I'm going to keep the discussions brief. It is just littered with exercises. You're more or less getting 2 hours of free SANS labs throughout this workshop. But there is some lead-in material that we must discuss. So we'll talk about an overall, a very generic, I must say, detection building process. Now, if you attended the previous webcast, which was building detections by hacking Azure Edition, I did an AWS edition of a webcast and a workshop prior to this. That was an hour of just discussions on how we can build detections and solve plenty of attack scenarios and how we would identify that attacker in Azure. And this workshop supports that, of course, where we're going to be building these detections out by hand. So once we get that detection building process out of the way, you're going to deploy some infrastructure that is both going to be your job to protect, as well as lay some of the groundwork, some of the framework to help build those detections themselves. Then we move into configuring proper logging inside of Azure. Something that I mentioned quite a bit in the webcast was many cloud vendors aren't doing us a whole lot of favors when it comes to having logging on by default, or at least usable by default for an analyst. So we're going to change that behavior a bit in the second exercise, so we gain more visibility. That way in exercise 3, when we perform our attack, create that true positive, if it were, we're able to see it. If we didn't do exercise 2, not going to have a whole lot of luck in exercise 3. Exercise 4, we're going to create a detection rule to be able to detect it automatically instead of having to manually craft searches over and over again, right? And also provide some kind of automation as well, some follow-up actions to help us out, to help the analyst. When the incident does occur, what does the analyst need to perform? Exercise 5, we test that our detection and our automation actually work, right? And then I do have some last minute thoughts and leaving some room for some Q&A as well. And then in exercise 6, because you are providing, I should have mentioned this right out the gate, because you are providing your own Azure account, we want to keep this as cheap as possible. So we have an exercise dedicated to tearing down all the things. Now, some will cringe when we say you're providing your own Azure account, your own credit card, you will be billed for this. But let me show you something here. I ran this workshop a couple of times now. I did a lot of test and development with this, and I will show you my subscription and what this is costing me. So in Azure, what we are having you provide, of course, is an Azure subscription. So if you did not do that yet, you might want to get on that. We should have had an email go out prior to the web or to the workshop saying as much. But when you go into your subscriptions, you should see that you have one active for sure. It's actually off to the right here. I have 2 of them that are active. Ignore this secure score. This is my sandbox environment. That's at least the excuse that I'm using right now. But you can see the one subscription that I have for this workshop and all the test and development is costing me a whopping 8 US cents. So it should be extremely cheap to run through this workshop. Okay. All right. I see some Q&A that keeps popping in about the Slack link. So one more time, so there were some folks that jumped in rather late here. I'll ask Laura to just keep posting that link maybe every 5 minutes, at least for the first few times. That way, anyone freshly joining will have that Slack link. All right. So again, Azure subscription, web browser is all you need to conduct this workshop. So let's get into the lead-in material. Again, I'll keep this really short because I want to get your hands dirty throughout this. I do have a disclaimer up front here that you will be attacking this Azure account. Now, I say that, are you really? Not really. Your attack, as you'll see, spoiler alert, is you're going to be downloading some files, some sensitive looking files. You're not going to be breaking into virtual machines and causing a lot of havoc by using a bunch of attack tools or anything like that. I leave this disclaimer here, though, because you will be deploying new things. You will be accessing them in strange ways. If you're using a corporate account, your security team may at least see this as abnormal behavior in the account, could generate an alert, could generate an incident. We want to avoid that at all costs. I don't want your organization being upset at me or at Sans or even at Sean, right? Being one of the co-authors of the course, because you're doing things to support this workshop. So, and this was the same disclaimer that I gave in the AWS workshop and one before that as well that I did, where you really did do a bunch of attacking. We just want you to be careful. We recommend you doing this in your own Azure account, if at all possible. We don't want to have this, and I don't think this would be the case for this workshop, but I've seen some things, right? We don't want this to turn into an RGE, which I'm stealing that from another SANS instructor, Brandon Evans, a resume generating event. All right, so what we expect you to have for various reasons is that brand new or at least your own Azure subscription with full rights, so everything works properly and you don't make your security team upset. Okay, if that's not the case, again, just be careful. Maybe at least ask the question to your security team saying, hey, I want to do this workshop. Here are some of the things that we're going to perform. Is that okay? Okay, so the overall process when creating these detections, and I stated earlier that this is generally speaking, and it really is general. We could, and we do across 5 days, talk about each and every one of these phases over and over and over again when you're developing these detections. Starting at the top, researching the attack technique. How are the attackers coming at you in your cloud environment, on-premise environment, cloud application, on-premise application, and so on? That takes some time. We're going to breeze through that very quickly in this workshop because we want to get your hands dirty. We want you to set up a detection, perform some attacks, make sure your detection and automation is actually working as well. All right, so we'll breeze through that, get into the setup, the proper logging, which again can take a significant amount of time. It's one thing to say what the vendor has by default versus what you need to turn on. It's another thing to make that log data actually useful to the analyst, right? Do you have the right log data, log settings enabled? Is that data enriched? Are you getting rid of data that you have no use having, right? To minimize cost in your SIM and increase search efficiencies, right? And much, much more could be discussed during the setup proper logging phase here, which again, we'll just kind of jump into what the vendor gives you because we just don't have a whole lot of time in this workshop, something that we cover quite a bit in Sec 541 as well. We're going to perform an attack, exposing your environment to that attack technique, making sure that we can visually see that, and then of course, build our detection at the end of this overall process, right? And notice it's a loop. We may need to go through this over and over again in the real world, making sure that we are adequately covering the capture, detection, the automation around these attack techniques, right? So that's the overall process that we're going to loosely tie this workshop to. And again, my talk went round and around that process several times. So the attack in this workshop that we're going to perform and detect is a very straightforward one, happens way too often, and that is stealing, exfiltrating data from cloud storage. Now, we're going to do that, of course, not with real sensitive data. We're going to create a honey file in our environment during the very first exercise. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about what that exercise is doing in just a moment, but that's going to be the file, the fictitious sensitive file that we're going to place an enormous amount of detection around. That way, if it is accessed, we know who accessed it, when it was accessed. If it was accessed in a strange or abnormal way, that could generate some kind of alert, or at least inform the analyst, we need to look into this, figure out who was ultimately downloading this file, how they got access to it, is this a known threat actor, and so on and so forth. We start answering some of those questions, okay? If we're going to deploy that file, we're going to log around that file, we're going to emulate that attack, we're going to review that breadcrumb, that trail that was left behind by our attack, and then finally build some sort of automation at the end of this workshop, right? A couple of them, I should say. So the first exercise, as I've alluded to, is where you're going to deploy some stuff into your Azure account. You're going to do that using an in-browser feature in Azure called Cloud Shell. It's a container environment which you access, like I said, via your web browser, which has a lot of tools baked into it. And yes, I do see the typo on it. I left it in here because I like to make fun of myself occasionally, right? My company that I own and work for, of course, is Blue Mountain Cyber. Yes, there is a typo at the very top of this screen. I can't even spell my own company's name right, apparently. But there is a GitHub repo spelled properly, Blue Mountain Cyber, called, and as you can see, I can't even spell building detections Azure. That's where all of the infrastructure as code, which you will be deploying, is ultimately coming from. So what's being deployed? Not very much. It'll move pretty quickly. You're going to be deploying an Azure storage account. That's where this sensitive data is going to reside. It's going to be called prod data, but it can't just be called prod data for the hundreds of people that are attending this workshop, because in Azure, storage accounts must be named uniquely across all of Azure. So we've introduced some randomness into it. So it will begin with the word prod data and have some random suffix at the end of it. But since we're going to be, detecting some things, we're going to have Microsoft Sentinel deployed into your environment as well. So there's some setup that's going to automatically happen for you during this exercise, right? And also be setting up, of course, the log analytics workspace, which Sentinel depends upon. That's its data store. And there's going to be some other moving parts deployed here as well. Not going to focus too much on what's being deployed because you're going to be using them throughout the exercises. But if you're interested, just poke around your Azure account if you have a few extra minutes and just see what has been magically appearing in your account at the end of this exercise. Now, the question might be, where in the world do I get access to these exercises? I don't see them in Zoom anywhere. I have a link, and I did spell it right this time, at the bottom of this screen. Every time you see an exercise screen coming up, and for those that come in late, they'll see it as well, I have at the very bottom the workbook for this workshop. So before I get into that, I just want to mention, because this question comes up quite a bit, and I'll probably say it again at the end as people are coming in late. I'm going to keep this URL up for the foreseeable future. So let's say you showed up, you weren't aware that you needed an Azure account, or you thought your Azure account was working. You get into exercise 1, realize your subscription is disabled, and you need to add a payment method, and you get a little bit behind, right? I'm going to leave this up for those instances, as well as if you want to play again later on. If you want to, maybe you felt like you were rushed through this, you want to spend a little bit more time, because we're doing a lot in 2 hours, I will admit. Welcome to SANS. If you've ever attended one of their lab exercises, you're in a bit of a time crunch in most cases, right? So I'm going to leave that up there for months, if not years, so you can continue to practice. You can also share this with your friends, your coworkers. Say, hey, I just attended this awesome workshop. Here's a link. Feel free, right? I have no problem with that. You do not have to sign up with SANS, pay me any money, anything like that. The URL is yours moving forward. But once you visit that URL, what the heck are you looking at, right? If you've attended a SANS course within the last year or two, this should look very familiar. This is the electronic workbook. Inside of VMs, or in my 488 and 541 class, we now host these online. You could access all of the lab material, right? So this has no authentication. It is wide open. So when you first get here, there's a quick discussion on what the exercises are, but to actually get to the exercises, just click on the exercises tab at the very top. This will bring you straight to exercise 1, which we're going to be doing over the next 15 minutes or so. Now you will do the entire exercise. You don't need to do all 6 exercises at this time. You can work ahead if you'd like, but after exercise 1 is complete, I'm going to regroup, talk about exercise 2 for just a minute or two, and then move into exercise 2, rinse and repeat as we go. I do that for a couple reasons. One, if you're just heads down the entire time, you may struggle. You may get into some weird scenarios. I kind of get ahead of some of those weirdness things right before we jump into the next exercise. But also, and this is nature of cloud, this is not picking on Azure. Sometimes when you set up logging or you launch an attack, it may be minutes before that log data shows up and is actually usable. So if you're just rushing through all the exercises, you may get to a point where like, I'm not seeing what the workbook is telling me I should be seeing. It's not there. What's going on? It's not you, it's Azure, or it's AWS, or it's Google Cloud Platform. It takes a little bit of time for that data to be visible by an analyst, right? 5, 10, sometimes 15 minutes or more. Okay, so that's another reason why we fragmented these exercises up the way we did, because we could have otherwise just did a gigantic exercise. Okay, so for right now, you're going to be working through exercise 1, where you're going to deploy the workshop resources. You're going to launch a Cloud Shell session, which again is that containerized environment with a bunch of command line tools for you to use. You're going to use Git to pull down the workshop code, the infrastructure as code that is, and then deploy using my favorite tool, Terraform. Okay, should take about 10 to 15 minutes on average. So I'll put a timer on the screen for 15 minutes. And once again, please don't hesitate to ask a question in Slack. If you have an issue, there's a help channel. Either myself or Sean McCulloch will assist you if you run into any weird scenarios, okay? But read everything very carefully. There are solutions. I encourage you to use the solutions by clicking on the green bars. That walks you through how to accomplish the task, right? Now, if you've done this stuff like, hey, I can launch Cloud Shell all day long, I don't need any help, then by all means, don't even look at the solution. But for most folks, you're going to be looking at the solution most of the time, right? Because again, it's the exact instructions that we expect you to follow to succeed with the exercises, right? So don't be a hero unless you feel that you're very confident in accomplishing this task. There's no shame in opening the solutions, especially given the time crunches that we have. So enjoy the first exercise. I'll shut up for a little while, and then we'll regroup after 15 minutes, talk about exercise 2, rinse and repeat as we go. So enjoy. Again, the link for the workbook is at the bottom of this slide. All right, so if you're still working, just continue to do so, but I want to discuss, or at least talk to a couple of issues that a few of you are having that are probably related to your Azure subscription. So I just want to verify something here. Maybe this is something we could add to our setup instructions for future runs of this, is to make sure everything's set up properly coming in. So if you're getting the error, I saw one already that's no subscription found. You can't find your subscription. So little background on Azure. It's one thing to have an Azure tenant. It's another thing to have a subscription in that tenant. A subscription is what allows Azure or you to pay Azure, right? And that's where your resources are ultimately deployed underneath that subscription. So to verify that you do in fact have a subscription in your Azure account, when you go to portal.azure.com, just click on or search for, we'll just say maybe it's not one of your most recent. You can search for subscriptions and click on the result, and it should bring you here. Now, if you have no subscriptions, you're going to have to create one, right? Now, if you've never set one up yet in this tenant, you should likely have the option to create a free trial account, which should work for this workshop. But it does take some time, of course, to spin up and be usable for you. So just want to note that it may not work 100% right out the gate. So if you're not seeing subscriptions, you need to get a subscription in place first and foremost. If you're like me, and you have 2 subscriptions or more, you may have gotten issues saying, like maybe you have some restrictions on a subscription. Maybe that's your work subscription, and they really tightened that down, as they should. And you can't deploy all the things that you need to for the workshop, but you have another subscription that gives you a little more breathing room, a little more capability. There is a blurb in exercise 1 at challenge 3. It's more or less, it's a breakout box that says, if you have multiple Azure subscriptions, here's how you tell Terraform actually the Azure CLI, which is what Terraform's keying in on, which subscription you want to deploy these things to. So it's just simply the command AZ account set -- subscription, and then the name of your subscription, right? So like here, I have two, Azure subscription 1 or development. I would choose development for this workshop for me, right? That could have led to some other issues. The other issue was also in challenge 3. This happens all the time. I mean, you can build automations all day long. Sean can vouch for this as well. They work day in, day out until they don't, right? So when we wrote this Terraform code, we tested the heck out of it. We ran this workshop once before. We've never seen this issue before, but now all of a sudden we do, right? That it happens. It could be Azure being weird. It could be a very busy time. It could be hundreds of people trying to do the same thing at the same time. Who knows? It could be Terraform being weird. There could be bugs in the Terraform code. But it seems to be that if you get a service principal not found or some kind of error like that, if you rerun Terraform, it seems to work magically. So I don't know why. I don't know if maybe it's a brand new account. It's still warming up. It could be Azure problems. It could be Terraform problems. It could be me. It could be my code. We really don't know, but it seems to be running it again will resolve those issues for everyone that's at least reported accordingly. All right. Let's see. I'm trying to dig through these just to make sure there's nothing else that I can quickly speak to that might have been an issue through this exercise, but looks like most of you that last one was the main issue, and that seemed to resolve itself just by rerunning Terraform apply. All right. So as I said, between these exercises, I'm going to make a quick, just maybe minute or two discussion on what the next exercise is going to be. So in the first exercise, of course, the whole goal was just to deploy stuff using Cloud Shell, using Terraform. Okay, so you should have some resources. Now, what we're trying to additionally gather here in your account is log data. As I led into this discussion a couple times already, I'd mentioned that many cloud vendors by default don't do a very good job of logging, right? At least what they give you as enabled, right? You can gain more visibility. And that's what we're going to be changing here in exercise 2. For example, in Azure, and not just picking on Azure, it's very similar in AWS and very, very similar in GCP. Out of the gate, brand new account, you've done nothing, you've turned on no additional logging. You do have some logs, but they're limited. Really what you get is API calls. So when you're at portal.azure.com, or you're using the Azure CLI, or you're using Terraform, and it's making a bunch of API calls to the vendor saying, here, make this thing happen, create this, delete this, change this, modify this configuration, and so on. Those are recorded, right? But they have to be changes to your environment in Azure. They have to be creation of a new resource, updating of a resource, or deletion of a resource, okay? If it's read actions, unfortunately, that is not there by default at all, okay? But that's all you get. So let's say I place a file inside of a storage account and I access that file. Unfortunately, you don't have that visibility by default. We have to make changes to our Azure account to be able to gain that visibility. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to detect. We're trying to detect somebody accessing a sensitive file that they shouldn't be accessing, okay? So exercise 2, what we're going to do is turn on what they call blob logs inside of Azure, storage blob logs to make it more appropriate. And what we're trying to gather is anytime a storage blob, which stands for a binary large object file in Azure, anytime a file is read, written, or deleted, and we're also going to log some metrics as well, like latencies and file sizes, things like that. We're going to collect all that information. And we're going to send that information to another service in Azure, which was created in the last exercise called a log analytics workspace. That log analytics workspace, its sole purpose in life, at least for us, is going to be collect log data, collect metric data for use with Sentinel later on. So we gain that visibility all over again, right? So exercise 2, it's going to be very straightforward. This is not going to be crossing your fingers, running some Terraform code and hoping it works. You're going to be working in the Azure portal itself. I do want to mention something that did come up in the last time we ran this workshop. So I'll go over to the exercise 2. And by the way, to get to the exercises, to go from exercise 1 to exercise 2, there's a left-hand navigation. Now, if you have a different resolution, say you're zoomed in really far, you might say, what left-hand navigation? I don't see anything here. the page is reactive, I think is the right word for it. So you can click on this hamburger button on the top left, and you'll see all the exercises there as well. But I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see my left-hand navigation. Go to exercise 2. Now, again, back to the thing that was a little weird with the last workshop, and we even saw this while we were developing the workshop. In challenge 2, and I like this little quote here, probably from cloud providers. I got to give Alex credit this one. It's best effort after all, right? Sometimes when you deploy something, you're going to make a change to something that's newly deployed. You can't yet. It's just not there. Maybe it's still building something in the background, or just the GUI hasn't refreshed yet for whatever reason. So there is a workaround to be able to configure these diagnostic settings, which is how you get that visibility, how you turn on that logging from Azure Cloud Shell instead of using the Azure portal. So you don't have to do this unless when you're going through the solution, which again, I encourage everyone to read the solutions. If you go into the diagnostic settings and you don't see this, right? You don't see anything here, like there's nothing to click on, then circle back and open up this red box here. That's going to walk you through how to do this from the Azure Cloud Shell itself. And then you're done, right? Then you've turned on the appropriate logging for the blob container. Now, if you just want to be on the command line, by all means, use the command line approach. We got both variants here. You don't have to do both of these. You have to do the command line if for some reason your settings just don't appear in Azure. Okay. Let's see. That's a new one, Jordan. In exercise 2, behind a self-signed certificate, browser gives this warning. That one is surprising. My guess is you probably have a proxy in line between you and Azure. At least I'm hoping I'm hoping Azure's not deciding to use self-signed certificates out of nowhere. I don't think that's the problem, but we'll look into that. We'll look into that one for you. But for everybody else, exercise 2, this one's much quicker than the last exercise because really you're just turning on logging, doing a little research on the attack that is going to be performed. So 10 minutes on the clock should be ample time. Also will allow some folks to catch up from the last exercise if you were having issues. All right, so enjoy, and we'll regroup in 10 minutes. All right, that was 10 minutes. Still have a few folks popping in here and there, still not seeing the option to turn on the diagnostic settings. So let me show you what I was talking about in the exercise here, in exercise 2. So we did have this little caveat in challenge 2 that is in red. It says it's best effort after all, cloud providers probably. So if you went to go to your storage accounts and they either weren't showing up, which may be an issue with exercise 1, maybe it didn't actually work for you, or maybe it did, it's just not, your resources aren't visible yet. Or, which I think is the case for most folks that we're having this issue, when you go into diagnostic settings, nothing shows up, right? You can't click on blob because it's not there. If either of those is the case, then try up above here, what's in this red box, right? It's in a red box inside of a green box, which shows you the command line variant of turning on those diagnostic settings, right? Now, unfortunately, I don't have like a run this command to make sure everything implemented properly. It's kind of a last ditch thing that we did really quickly to try to solve these issues. So I would just say, you don't get any errors here, we're going to treat that as good, right? So again, if you're not seeing it in the Azure portal, the ability to turn on those diagnostic settings, you could either wait a while. They do eventually show up, sometimes 30 minutes or more. In fact, the last time we ran the workshop, one of the folks, they were just like, I'm just going to use the GUI version. I'm patient. I'll just wait. They waited the entire workshop and those diagnostic settings never showed up. In fact, of all people, the person TAing for me, being the assistant, theirs had the same issue. They didn't notice theirs showed up until the following day. So I'm going to encourage you to not wait that long and run these commands, which you can copy and paste, by the way, from the workbook by clicking on this copy to clipboard button. It's kind of hidden, but it's in the top right of where you see these code blocks to copy this out of the workbook and paste that into your Cloud Shell window. And that should take care of those diagnostic settings for you, okay? But that was pretty easy if it worked, of course, properly. Again, welcome to the world of cloud. Sometimes there's a bit of delay here as well. So now we have logging in place. Now we can move on to our third exercise where we attack our environment. Now I'm using air quotes. This is just run-of-the-mill accessing a file. But again, we're simulating an attacker that might have stolen Azure credentials, and they're going to use them against us. Something we do in 541 at the beginning of each day is we tell a bit of a story. It's what makes the class very, very unique. We start off the day talking about a previous breach and all of the techniques that we either know happened 100%, or that's at least how it's been reported, or even the attacker, they're bragging, hey, I did this thing. Or we kind of go off script a little bit, say this very well could have happened. But what most of those stories have in common is a stolen credential. A stolen cloud credential can just lead to very, very bad things, okay? So we're going to assume for a moment that our own credential got leaked somewhere, and the attacker is using that to access that sensitive data in our environment. And we want to build that detection to be able to capture that activity. So what's the attacker ultimately doing? Really, it could be just a couple of API calls at the end of the day. One could be list out all of the blobs that I have access to, or all of the files that I have access to given this credential. And if anything looks appetizing or enticing, the follow-on action would of course be download the file, right? If I see passwords.txt as an attacker, I'm probably going to download that file. If I see credit card numbers.csv or customer data or proprietary info or anything like that, I'm going to download that data. So that's what we're simulating here in exercise number 3. Right? This one does take a little bit more effort because, again, you're going to start with that presumed stolen credential, and you're going to be using the command lines. You're going to be using Cloud Shell once again to just ransack this environment, looking for that data of interest, downloading that data. And if you have a little bit of extra time, there's a secret message at the very end. If you can crack that message, bonus points to you. Just let us know or don't spoil it for everyone if you don't want to. But just let me know at the very least, hey, I was able to crack the code. Maybe send a direct message of what that cracked code was. Alex added a little hidden secret in this exercise as well. So feel free. But otherwise, I'm going to set the timer for 20 minutes. Should be enough time for this exercise, and also allowing some folks to catch up from any troublesome exercises that, in exercise 1 or 2, they may have been leaving them behind a little bit. So enjoy. Again, please reach out over Slack if you run into any weird issues. All right, I see some folks that are banging their head off their desk trying to figure out this code, myself included. Little did you know, I didn't crack it yet either. To be honest, I didn't spend a lot of time, but even putting a lot of time into it, I still may not. But one of you sent me a sidebar message here saying, hey, yes, looks like base 64, but the next step actually looks like base 45, which I'll show you what I was working with here myself. Again, I put like a couple minutes into this. What I posted in Slack was this wonderful tool, use it all the time, CyberChef. So this was the code at the end of the exercise that you end up discovering, that file that you stole, this was part of its contents. And to the trained eye, this looks like base 64. Like base 64, there are 64 possible characters, uppercase letters, lowercase letters, I should say Latin ASCII characters, pluses, forward slashes, equal signs. What am I missing? I'm missing one of them. Oh, no, I'm not. Okay, 64 possible characters, and then the equal signs are padding, right? So in CyberChef, you can perform these operations as part of your recipe, going with the chef theme, to say like, take this and then convert this from base 64, right? And you're left with this garbage. And this is where I started, surfing the Google, like, what the heck is this content? I've never seen a file that started with these hex characters or what have you, like, what is this? And one of you brought to my attention, you did this for us, this part of your recipe from base 45. And now we start to see what look like hex characters. But from here, I didn't go any further. So if you figure it out, I'd love to hear how you got the answer. But it's looking like it's at least starting with, and I could be totally wrong, base 64 and then base 45. Where it goes from there, I do not know. Because again, I didn't solve it myself. All right. So in any case, that was exercise 3, where you created some true positive events. You were mimicking 2 attack techniques. One, just seeing what's available with these credentials. What cloud storage do you have access to? Because you did in challenge 1 using some awesome PowerShell and some AZ commands, I should say, the Azure CLI tools, which are also part of the Cloud Shell experience. And then you honed in on some files that looked pretty appetizing to you. You downloaded some files. including the final instructions, which again, we're trying to crack still. Not part of the workshop, totally bonus, but if you figure it out, I'd love to see it. Now we're going to move into exercise 4, really where the magic's happening, where we're creating a detection rule. We're going to uncover what was going on here, create that detection rule, create an automation, and then we'll test it out in the final exercise. So if the diagnostic setting was set up properly, you will know for sure in this exercise, because if you go to log analytics and there's nothing there, and it's been a while, a few minutes since you've run those commands in the last exercise, something probably went wrong with exercise 2. So you may need to double check exercise 2 to make sure your diagnostic setting is into place, or yet again, you're at the mercy of the cloud vendor. This might be a few more minutes until that log data starts to show up for whatever reason, okay? Because there is some delay in these cases. Once the data is there, though, there's going to be some key columns of data that could be pretty telling of what went down. Like who was accessing that data? What operation were they performing? What API call, if it were? What storage account was being accessed? Which file path was being accessed, and so on, right? So in this next exercise, you're going to be playing with KQL. And no, it's not Kibana query language. We have a name collision here. That's Elastic's tool, Kibana, if you've ever used that before. That's not what we're using. We're using Kusto query language, which finds its way in many Microsoft platforms for performing searches against data. That's what's used in Sentinel. That's what's used in log analytics. That's what's used in a variety of Defender for X products in Microsoft as well. So it's a very good language to know if you're going to be performing log analysis inside of anything Microsoft. So you're going to start by building these queries, looking for evidence that you had accessed that data. And again, if you come up empty, it's probably because the data is not being delivered. That could mean the diagnostic setting was not actually put into place, or it hasn't been long enough. You may have to rerun the attacks in exercise 3 just to see the data eventually show up in exercise 4. It comes with the territory. You're going to be feeling some of my pain that I go through on a regular basis with these cloud vendors and log data. So don't beat yourself up if this is not successful of an exercise for you. It comes with the territory for sure. All right, so in exercise 4, you're going to create the detection rule and create, I should say, the automation, which will take place in the next exercise when you re-attack your account. So this one's a bit longer. I don't think we're going to need the full 30 minutes for this. In fact, that would take us nearly to the end of the workshop. So I'm going to set aside 20 minutes again to go through this exercise, and I'll really quickly get you into exercise 5. Okay, so enjoy this exercise. We're almost done. Troubleshooting here. Yeah, more time for decoding. Of those that cannot see Sentinel, have any of you had this Azure account for a while, or is it everybody has had a brand new account? And maybe it's a new account thing. New account, brand new. Brand new. I had one. Old account works. Brand new working like a charm. Yes. So that doesn't help. It's looking like, though, that many of you did have new ones. Maybe that's part of it. Could be a new account, could be a new subscription. It's anybody's guess at this point without a little more trial and error, which we don't have ample time to do, unfortunately. But we'll roll on like well, thank you, Laura. Welcome to cloud. Exactly right. Yeah, welcome to day 1 of a SANS cloud course. Happens quite often that we just see really bizarre issues. But in any case, let me do my really quick rundown of exercise 4 here, just so you know what we were trying to get accomplished here. So the first bit in challenge 1 was to look at those storage logs. Now, if Sentinel were visible, you could have gone to Sentinel, clicked on the Microsoft Sentinel result, and you will hopefully have found security monitoring, right? That's the log analytics workspace in which we've enabled all these wonderful Sentinel features, only a few of which we're going to be working with throughout this workshop. It's got a lot more where that came from, right? It's a very wonderful product. To get to the raw log data, right? It's very straightforward. You go to the logs section. And here, you'll be presented with some like cookie cutter screens like welcome to Sentinel, welcome to logs, here's some sample queries. We're just going to ignore all that because we're going to handcraft these queries ourselves. Now, to see the data that you can work with, there's a little slider off to the left-hand side you can click on, which will open up and show you all of the different logs that are available for you, all the different tables, I should say. There's a lot of, if you're familiar with SQL, SQL, structured query language, there's a lot of terminology, vernacular similarities with KQL, Kusto query language. So your data is in tables, that data is stored in columns. Inside of those tables, there's rows of data. So if you're familiar with SQL, you'll be right at home here. Although the logic and the queries look quite different, as you'll see in a little bit. But where we're going to dig into is the storage blob logs. Any interaction with your storage blob data, which you enabled all the way back in exercise 2, should now begin to appear inside of this table. If it didn't, it either the diagnostic setting is not working properly, maybe you need to recreate it, or it's just been it hasn't been long enough that when you interacted with that data that it's now arriving in log analytics. Could be a number of things, okay? But in a perfect world, that data is in storage blob logs. So you start sifting through that data. And you can simply craft a query just targeting that table, storage blob logs over the last 4 hours. That will show you every interaction with that data. And it should be very minimal. It's just you, hopefully, interacting with that data, a couple of lines tops. But in the real world, if you are interacting with the last 4 hours of storage data, you could have thousands, tens of thousands, millions of interactions that you would have to manually parse through. That is not efficient at all, which is why we build a more mature query as we go on. So first, we're going to see what kind of interactions were being had, like how many get blob operations were being performed, how many list blobs, and so on and so forth. So that's what our first main query is doing for us here. Just give me some high level details of those interactions. And then we start to dig into interactions in particular we may be interested in, like the downloading of data. Get blob is that API call for downloading data from an Azure storage account. So we take a look at those interactions in particular. And again, you can see all the wealth of information that comes along with those log entries. Okay. Now to build the detection, we're going to get a little more involved here because we're looking for interactions to a particular file in a particular storage account. So now we have a 4-line log query that looks at our storage blob logs. And you'll see this is what a lot of the similarities with SQL, where a particular column has a value. So where account name starts with prod data, because that's the name of your storage account. That's how it begins. Where the operation name has a value of get blob, someone's downloading that data. Where the object key, which is the file name, is final instructions.txt. Putting all that together, if we have a hit, that could be our detection. Someone's downloading that sensitive file, that honey file, that whatever that they should not be accessing. Okay. And we get a little more involved here by extracting out the attacker IP address. You'll see where that comes into play in a later challenge in this exercise for your automation, because you're going to want to see who's been accessing that data. Hand that data over to the analyst for their quick visibility. Okay. So after you created that, you're going to use that logic to create what's called a scheduled query rule, because you don't want to have to run these queries over and over and over again yourself manually, right? Let's use some automation here. Let's use some capabilities from the cloud vendor. In challenge 3, you were creating this analytic. And analytics come in a variety of flavors, one being the scheduled query, which we're going to work with. One is an NRT query, which means near real time. It's a fancy way of saying it's a scheduled query. It just runs every minute, okay? We're not going to run ours every minute. We're going to, as you'll see, we'll run ours every 15 minutes or so, okay? We're going to choose the scheduled query. We're going to give the required details here, like give it a name, describe what it's doing, select the MITRE attack techniques that we believe this thing is catching. So some discovery and downloading of cloud data as you've selected here. Then onto the rule logic. This is the reason why you created the query that you created. What's it going to base an alert or an incident off of? So you just more or less copy and paste your query where you found that evidence into this rule logic, and this will run automatically for you every 15 minutes. If there's a match, an alert, and in our case, an incident will be generated. Somebody's accessing data that they really shouldn't be, okay? And the rest is the entity mapping, where you're trying to extract data from those log records to inform the analyst who's been accessing a resource, what that resource was, and so on, right? As you'll see later on in the next exercise, okay? And last but not least was another automation. I'm going to skip down to challenge 4. Now, you can go crazy with these automations. You can have cloud services take action. You can have that IP address that we extracted have it blocked, right? Maybe there was a user account involved. Have those credentials be automatically rotated. Stop the user from doing anything in the Azure account. We're not going to be that aggressive. We're just going to provide some instructions to our incident handlers. Hey, if you see this alert, here are some things. Here's a playbook. Here are some tasks that you need to perform to fully run down this incident. Okay, that's what we're doing in Challenge 4. Not super sexy, but it's something. It's right. It's some form of automation that we can use here. We're going to be adding these tasks. Again, informing the analyst or the investigator, investigate the account, figure out who's been performing this action, figure out what host was used, what system were they coming from? Was it an outside system? Was it an enterprise system? Was it a cloud system? Try to figure that out too as part of your analysis. And then decide on an escalation path. Now that will of course depend on, well, was it an infected system? Where do we go from here? Was it a user doing rogue things, or was it a believed to be stolen credential? The follow-up will vary depending on what you figure out from the other investigatory steps, if that's even a word, okay? So that's the end of exercise 4. Lots going on in that exercise. That's really the bulk of the workshop. Hopefully that was working for most of you, although again, we found out the hard way that Azure seems to be having some really strange issues, or it's because the accounts are too new, or a combination of both, or who knows, right? Again, welcome to the world of cloud. But hopefully you got some value out of that. And if you want to later on, once everything's working properly for you, you'll be able to continue on with exercise 4, which will lead you into exercise 5. Okay, so speaking of exercise 5, not much else to talk about here, because you're going to be doing a combination of things. Exercise 3, you're basically doing that all over again. We just have some short and sweet commands you can copy and paste from the workbook, run in Cloud Shell. That should eventually create a detection, create that incident inside of Sentinel, if you can get to Sentinel, of course, right? Now, this can take anywhere from instant to about 15 minutes for that to show up, okay? So I'm going to set a timer. I know we're going to go a little bit beyond our 5 o'clock PM, but I do have some wrap-up stuff I want to talk about. So I think what I'll do is set just a 10-minute timer. If the detection didn't come up yet for you, that's fine. Just wait a little longer. I'm going to do my wrap-up stuff, and then I'll be around for the next few minutes afterwards, after we've concluded, just in case you want to work through some additional issues here and there as we go, right? I'll stick around for you, but I don't want to hold everybody up that is working properly like for no reason, okay? So bear with me on that. So take the next 10 minutes, work through exercise 5, and then we'll move into the finale, the wrap up of the workshop. All right, well, we've hit 5 o'clock. So again, I want to keep people longer than they need to be, because we did promise 3 to 5 for this workshop. So I'll do a quick wrap up very, very quickly. So more or less, what we did in this workshop was just one round of that pipeline that I talked about before, where we researched an attack, turned on the proper logging, attacked it ourselves. We could see what that attack would look like, created detection, all that good stuff. And this was just one round. There's much more where this came from. Someone had asked a question in Zoom, like how else could we understand what the attacker was doing? Like where the credentials came from, where else would they have gone in this account? Did they just stick to downloading this data? That's to be determined, right? We would have to analyze even more log data, turn on more log data, make sure that the data is actionable, and so on and so forth. So this process we've worked through, it's not a one and done thing. It's going to be many attack techniques will be looked at through this lens, several different ways. And again, just knowing how the attackers operate is really half the battle here, and how to visually see what they're doing in your cloud account, right? So just one example of endless possibilities that you could take away. So hopefully you understand the overall process, though. That was really the point of the workshop. And then just, of course, seeing one practical example moving forward. Okay. So I'm going to leave the Q&A. I'm just going to mention that feel free to reach out. I posted my LinkedIn on in Slack in the Discuss channel. Please feel free to reach out. I do consult too, so just throwing that out there just to mention it, of course. But I'll also be monitoring this workshop channel for the next several minutes, just in case you want to work through some issues or just ask some last minute questions. Feel free. I'll be here. Just want to mention that but this workshop was designed around a lot of the concepts that we put into Sec 541. And I mentioned this early on, like just researching attacks, right? We spent a significant amount of time in 541 understanding how attackers operate in cloud environments so that we can catch them. We also talk a lot about when log data is not available, how to enable it, how to enrich that data, maybe even strip out some of the data that we may find meaningless from an analyst perspective, at least. Centralizing that data in a SIM and much of that. And of course, the detection is covered pretty heavily in that course. So this is my one marketing, my one salesy slide. I promise I'll move on from it. Just note that I'd love to see you in class. It's being taught a few times over the next few months. Once in Munich, both in person and online, with Alex Braulich, who again had a huge helping hand in putting this workshop together. Also is the one responsible for that code, by the way. And also coming up with Sean, who was TAing this event for us. You may have been interacting with him. In July, he'll be in Washington, D.C. at Sandsfire. And of course, you can take this on demand as well with Sean. He was the one in the awesome studio doing the recording of the class. So I hope to see you there in class. And the rest of the curriculum is listed out here as well. It's not just Sec 541 as part of the cloud security curriculum. There's a number of courses now. This has greatly increased the amount of coverage across all things cloud over just the last couple years. It started as a single class as a curriculum, and you can just see how much it's grown. So lots of opportunity to continue learning all the cloud things. Hope to see you around. So really the last exercise that we have is tearing down all the resources. Now I mentioned it's extremely cheap to go through this workshop, probably 2 to 3 US cents for these last 2 hours. But if you don't want to pay, say, 20 cents at the end of the month, you may want to tear these things down. So that's all exercise 6 is about. Super easy to do. You just run another Terraform command. Now it's instead of Terraform apply, it's Terraform destroy, which will take everything down. So it should only take you just a handful of minutes to work through that. Of course, reach out if you run into any issues. All right, I have my email address here as well if you want to continue to reach out. I'll leave this slide up in Zoom if you want to copy anything down. Yes, the emoji is part of the LinkedIn profile. That's just a little pro tip I use to keep all of the garbage communication out of my LinkedIn. At least I try to. I did put that in Slack though as well, if you want to use that to not be a stranger, right? So that's all I have. Hopefully you enjoyed the workshop. I certainly did. I certainly enjoy working through the Azure struggles. Again, it's not just Azure. AWS has their issues occasionally, same with GCP. We just happen to find many of them during this workshop. So hopefully though that you did enjoy it, you enjoyed the content, and hope to see you around. So have fun, everyone. And again, I'll be in Slack for the next few minutes in case you want to ask questions or work through some remaining issues.